At a small private airport tucked away in the outskirts of a bustling city, something unusual happened. A man stepped off a sleek private jet, dressed in a crisp military uniform adorned with medals and badges that spoke of years of service and sacrifice. This wasn't just any officer. This was a high-ranking general from the Pentagon, someone who had spent decades protecting his country and leading troops through some of the toughest missions imaginable. But today, instead of being greeted with respect, he found himself facing something far less dignified. The terminal at this private airport was reserved for the wealthy and powerful, people who owned companies worth billions, flew in private jets, and lived lives most could only dream of. On this particular day, a group of these elite individuals had gathered near the tarmac, chatting casually while waiting for their own flights. When they noticed the general stepping off the plane, there was a moment of recognition. They saw the uniform, the medals, the stern expression, but none of it seemed to matter to them. One of the men smirked and muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Look who's here. Is this guy lost? Did he come to ask for more money?" Another chimed in with a laugh, saying, "Maybe he wants us to fund another one of those useless projects the government always talks about." The comments grew louder, sharper, and more mocking as the group fed off each other's energy. Jokes about taxpayer dollars, pointless wars, and bloated budgets filled the air. To them, this man standing before them wasn't a hero or a leader. He was just another faceless bureaucrat begging for scraps of their fortune. They didn't know him personally, nor did they care to. All they saw was someone representing an institution they loved to criticize during cocktail parties and boardroom meetings. Their words carried a mix of arrogance and disdain, completely dismissing the weight of his presence. But what they failed to realize was that this man wasn't there by chance. His visit to this airport wasn't random. It was part of a carefully planned mission. Intelligence reports had surfaced linking several prominent business figures to activities that threatened national security. Among these individuals were some of the very people now laughing at him. What they thought was a harmless jab at a government official would soon prove to be a grave mistake. The general stood tall, his posture unwavering despite the verbal assault. Years of training and experience taught him how to keep his emotions in check, even in the face of disrespect. He didn't say a word, didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Inside, however, the insults stung. Not because they hurt his pride, but because they highlighted a deeper issue: the disconnect between those who served and those who profited. As he walked past the group toward the waiting car, one of them called out mockingly, "Hey, General, maybe you should try selling insurance when you retire." The comment drew more laughter from the crowd, but the general simply nodded politely and kept moving. To anyone watching, it might have looked like he was letting the insults slide, choosing to rise above the pettiness. And perhaps, on the surface, that's exactly what he was doing. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the calm exterior, wheels were already turning in his mind. These men thought they were untouchable, shielded by their wealth and influence. They believed their connections and power made them invincible. What they didn't know was that the man they were ridiculing had access to tools and resources they couldn't even imagine. Classified information, global networks, and strategic alliances, all at his fingertips. While they laughed and clinked glasses in celebration of their own superiority, he was silently cataloging every detail. Their faces, their voices, their careless arrogance. He knew their world well enough to understand how it worked, and how to dismantle it if necessary. For now, though, he said nothing. There would be time for that later. As the car pulled away from the airport, the general glanced back briefly at the group still gathered on the tarmac. They were too busy congratulating themselves to notice him watching. If they had known what was coming next, they might not have been so quick to mock. But ignorance is bliss, as they say, and in this case it would cost them dearly. What followed in the days and weeks ahead would change everything. The general wasn't the type to hold grudges, but he also wasn't someone who tolerated threats to his nation's safety, or personal attacks meant to belittle his life's work. Every insult, every snide remark, every condescending laugh would be remembered. And soon, these men would learn that crossing paths with someone like him came with consequences they could never have anticipated. The car ride back to headquarters was quiet, but the general's mind was anything but. He stared out the window, watching the city blur past as thoughts raced through his head. The laughter from the airport still echoed in his ears, not because it hurt his feelings, but because it reminded him of a bigger problem. These weren't just rich men making jokes. They were powerful figures who thought they were above the law. And based on what he'd uncovered recently, some of them were playing dangerous games that put lives at risk. Back at his office, the general sat down at his desk and pulled up a file on his computer. It wasn't marked with any fancy title or classified stamp. It didn't need to be. Inside this folder were pieces of information that painted a troubling picture. One name stood out among the rest: a billionaire businessman whose company specialized in cutting-edge technology. This man wasn't just wealthy, he was influential, with connections that spanned continents. But according to intelligence reports, his empire had ties to something far darker than anyone realized. The general leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He knew how these things worked. People like this billionaire didn't dirty their own hands, they hired others to do the heavy lifting. Shell companies, offshore accounts, fake partnerships, all tools used to hide illegal activities. In this case, the evidence suggested that advanced surveillance equipment manufactured by the billionaire's company had ended up in the wrong hands. Equipment meant to protect people was now being used against them, but proving it wouldn't be easy. The billionaire was careful, too careful. He had lawyers, lobbyists, and PR teams ready to squash any hint of scandal before it even surfaced. Going after him directly would mean stepping into a minefield of legal battles and public backlash. No, the general decided, this required a different approach. If you wanted to take down someone like this, you had to think several steps ahead and make sure they never saw you coming. The first step was gathering more proof. The general reached out to trusted contacts within intelligence agencies around the world. Some owed him favors, others simply respected his reputation. Together, they began piecing together a trail of transactions, emails, and documents that pointed to the billionaire's involvement. Each new discovery added another layer to the puzzle, showing just how deep the web of corruption went. At the same time, the general started planting seeds of doubt. He leaked small bits of information to journalists known for digging into corporate scandals. Nothing too big, just enough to raise eyebrows and get people asking questions. A whispered tip here, an anonymous email there. Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in the billionaire's polished image. Stock prices dipped slightly as investors grew nervous. Employees started questioning whether their company was truly as ethical as it claimed to be. Meanwhile, the general kept a close eye on the billionaire himself. Through discreet surveillance, he learned about upcoming meetings, business deals, and travel plans. Every detail mattered, no matter how insignificant it seemed. He also made sure to monitor the reactions of the billionaire's inner circle. When rumors started spreading about potential investigations, panic rippled through the ranks. Trusted advisors turned on each other, pointing fingers and trying to cover their tracks. The general watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. But he wasn't done yet. Taking down one man wasn't enough, not when the problem ran so much deeper. The general knew that exposing the billionaire would send shockwaves through the entire system, forcing others to reconsider their actions. It was a calculated risk, but one he was willing to take. After all, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message. A reminder that no one, not even the richest, most powerful people on Earth, was untouchable. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The billionaire tried to fight back, hiring private investigators to track down the source of the leaks. But every lead they followed led to dead ends. False trails, fabricated evidence, and carefully placed distractions ensured that the truth remained hidden until the right moment. The billionaire grew increasingly frustrated, lashing out at anyone he suspected of betrayal. His once unshakable confidence began to crumble under the weight of uncertainty. Through it all, the general remained calm and focused. He knew better than to rush. Patience was key. Wait too long and the opportunity might slip away. Act too soon, and the plan could fall apart. So he bided his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, it would hit hard, leaving the billionaire scrambling to pick up the pieces of his shattered empire. For now, though, the general kept moving forward, one step at a time. Each decision, each action, brought him closer to his goal. What started as a personal affront at the airport had evolved into something much larger, a mission to hold those in power accountable for their actions. Whether they liked it or not, change was coming. And when it arrived, they would have no one to blame but themselves. The game was now in full swing, and the general was playing it masterfully. Every move he made was deliberate, every decision calculated. He wasn't just dismantling one man's empire. He was unraveling a network of corruption that had been thriving in plain sight for years. But this wasn't about brute force or flashy tactics, it was about precision. Like a spider weaving its web, the general worked patiently, knowing that even the smallest misstep could ruin everything. One of the first things he did was reach out to a journalist known for exposing corporate scandals. This reporter wasn't your typical newsroom hack-chasing clicks. They were relentless, thorough, and had a knack for connecting dots others missed. The general didn't reveal his identity when contacting them. Instead, he sent an anonymous tip, attaching a few carefully selected documents that hinted at shady dealings within the billionaire's company. Nothing too damning, at least not yet, but enough to pique the journalist's interest. Within days, the story started gaining traction. Headlines began popping up online questioning the ethics of the billionaire's business practices. At first it seemed minor, just another corporate scandal in a world full of them. But as more details emerged, the narrative shifted. Questions arose about how certain technologies developed by the company ended up in regions known for conflict. Whispers spread about secret deals brokered under the table. The billionaire tried to dismiss it all as baseless accusations, but the cracks in his armor were starting to show. Meanwhile, the general turned his attention to another front: finances. Money was the lifeblood of any empire, and cutting off its flow would cripple even the most powerful players. Using encrypted communications, he coordinated with international allies to freeze assets tied to shell companies linked to the billionaire. Banks suddenly refused to process transactions. Overseas accounts were flagged for suspicious activity, and key partners began pulling out of deals. It was like watching a domino effect, one collapse leading to another, until the entire structure teetered on the brink of failure. But perhaps the most brilliant part of the plan was how invisible it all was. To the outside world, it looked like bad luck or poor management. Stock prices fell because of market volatility. Business contracts fell through due to unforeseen circumstances. Employees left the company citing personal reasons. No one suspected that behind each setback was a carefully orchestrated effort led by someone who knew exactly where to strike. The billionaire, however, wasn't oblivious to what was happening. He felt the walls closing in, though he couldn't pinpoint why. His advisors scrambled to explain the sudden downturn, blaming everything from global economic shifts to bad press. But deep down, he knew something was off. Someone or something was targeting him. And so he decided to fight back. He hired a team of private investigators, sparing no expense to uncover the source of the leaks. These weren't amateurs. They were seasoned pros skilled at tracking down even the faintest trails. They combed through emails, phone records, and financial statements, searching for any clue that might lead them to the culprit. But every time they thought they were close, they hit a dead end. False leads sent them chasing ghosts, fabricated evidence muddied the waters, and carefully timed distractions kept them spinning their wheels. What they didn't realize was that the general was always 10 steps ahead. He anticipated their moves before they even made them, feeding them misinformation designed to waste their time and resources. For instance, one investigator became convinced that a disgruntled former employee was behind the leaks. Weeks were spent interrogating the man, only to discover he had nothing to do with it. Another lead pointed to a rival company trying to sabotage the billionaire's business. Again, countless hours were wasted pursuing a theory that ultimately led nowhere. As the chaos unfolded, the billionaire grew increasingly paranoid. He started doubting everyone around him, even those closest to him. Was his CFO secretly working against him? Had his PR team sold him out? Could his own family be involved? Trust, once a cornerstone of his success, began to erode. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Decisions were delayed out of fear of making the wrong move. The once unified inner circle fractured into factions, each pointing fingers and looking for someone else to blame. And yet, despite all the turmoil, the general remained calm. He watched from the shadows, observing as the billionaire's world unraveled piece by piece. There was no rush, no need to push too hard. The pressure was doing most of the work for him. With each passing day, the billionaire's grip on power weakened. Investors lost faith, clients walked away, even friends stopped returning his calls. By the time the truth finally came to light, there would be nothing left to save. But the general wasn't done yet. While the billionaire struggled to hold on to his crumbling empire, the general set his sights on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one man. It was about sending a message to anyone else who thought they were untouchable. Wealth and influence didn't grant immunity. They only made you a bigger target. And if you crossed the wrong line, there would be consequences, no matter how high you stood or how deep your pockets ran. As the operation continued, the general reflected on the events that had brought him here. That day at the airport hadn't just been an insult, it had been a wake-up call. It reminded him of the gap between those who served and those who profited, between sacrifice and privilege. What he was doing now wasn't personal. It was necessary. A reminder that accountability wasn't optional, no matter who you were. In the end, the billionaire wouldn't see it coming. Not really. Oh, he'd suspect betrayal, conspiracy, maybe even government intervention. But he'd never guess that. The man he mocked at the airport, the same man he dismissed as irrelevant, was the architect of his downfall. And by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late. The billionaire's life was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Once the king of his domain, now he felt like a man trapped in quicksand. Every attempt to escape only pulled him deeper. His once impenetrable empire was crumbling around him brick by brick, and the harder he fought, the faster it fell apart. What made it worse was that he couldn't figure out who was behind it all. Every lead he chased turned into a dead end. Every suspect turned out to be innocent, and every solution he tried ended in failure. Back at his sprawling mansion, late one restless night, the billionaire sat alone in his study, staring at a wall covered in notes, photos, and documents pinned haphazardly with red string connecting them. It looked like something out of a detective movie, but this wasn't fiction. It was his reality. He had spent weeks piecing together what little information he could find, trying to make sense of the chaos engulfing his life. But no matter how hard he tried, the puzzle refused to come together. Whoever was doing this knew exactly what they were doing, and they weren't leaving any clues behind. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was another call from his lawyer, updating him on yet another lawsuit filed against his company. This time, it was a whistleblower, claiming illegal arms deals involving technology sold to hostile nations. The billionaire sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. How is this even possible? He muttered under his breath. He hadn't personally signed off on those deals. That was the job of his executives, but he knew enough about the inner workings of his business to understand that these accusations weren't entirely baseless. Somewhere along the line, someone had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. As if things weren't bad enough, the media circus surrounding his downfall showed no signs of slowing down. Reporters camped outside his office building day and night, snapping photos and shouting questions whenever he dared to step outside. Social media was ablaze with memes mocking his plummeting stock prices and leaked emails exposing questionable decisions. Even his own employees began distancing themselves, afraid of being associated with a sinking ship. Friends who used to wine and dine with him suddenly stopped answering his calls. The isolation was suffocating. But the worst part? The uncertainty. Not knowing who was orchestrating all of this gnawed at him constantly. Was it a rival company trying to ruin him? A disgruntled former employee seeking revenge? Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more personal. A memory flashed in his mind. The private airport, the laughter, the insults hurled at the general. Could it really be him? No, that didn't make sense. How could some military official have the resources or connections to pull off something this elaborate? Besides, why would he care enough to retaliate over a few jokes? Still, the thought lingered. That man had stood there silently, taking their mockery without so much as blinking. There was something unsettling about that calm demeanor, like a storm brewing beneath the surface. Maybe he underestimated him. Maybe they all did. While the billionaire wrestled with doubt, the general continued his operation with precision. Every setback the billionaire faced was another step closer to justice. But this wasn't just about punishing one man. It was about dismantling an entire system built on greed and corruption. The general knew that people like the billionaire operated in shadows, exploiting loopholes and bending rules to suit their needs. They believed they were untouchable because of their wealth and influence, and for too long they'd been right. But not anymore. The general decided it was time to tighten the screws further. Using his network of trusted allies, he arranged for key figures within the billionaire's organization to receive anonymous letters detailing incriminating evidence against them. These weren't empty threats. They contained real information enough to send anyone involved straight to prison. The goal was simple: create paranoia and distrust among the billionaire's closest advisors. If they started turning on each other, the collapse would happen faster and cleaner. It worked better than expected. Within days, high-ranking executives began resigning left and right, citing personal reasons or health concerns. Others demanded immunity in exchange for cooperation, spilling secrets they hoped would save their own skins. Board meetings turned into shouting matches as accusations flew across the table. Loyalty, once a cornerstone of the billionaire's success, evaporated overnight. Everyone was looking out for themselves now, scrambling to distance from the wreckage before it consumed them completely. Through it all, the general watched silently, methodically documenting every move. He didn't need to intervene directly. The foundation was already cracking under its own weight. All he had to do was guide the process, ensuring that nothing got swept under the rug. Every leak, every scandal, every resignation brought him closer to his ultimate goal. And then came the final blow. A major news outlet published a bombshell report exposing the full extent of the billionaire's illegal activities. The article laid out everything in painstaking detail. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the arms deals, the bribes, documents, emails, and financial records backed up every claim. By morning, the story had gone viral, dominating headlines worldwide. Politicians called for investigations. Law enforcement agencies launched probes. Shareholders panicked, dumping stocks en masse. The billionaire's company teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. For the first time, the billionaire truly understood the gravity of his situation. This wasn't just a rough patch. It was the end. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. And the most frustrating part? He still didn't know who was responsible. That evening, as he sat alone in his darkened study, the billionaire picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. "Hello?" It said cautiously. "It's me," the billionaire replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I need your help." There was a pause on the line. Then softly, almost sympathetically, the voice responded, "I'm sorry. I can't." The line went dead. The billionaire stared at the phone for a long moment, then slowly placed it back on the desk. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. Whatever happened next, he would face it alone. The billionaire's world was falling apart, and there was no one left to turn to. The people he once trusted, the advisors, the lawyers, the friends who swore loyalty, had all abandoned him. Some had cut ties publicly, issuing statements to distance themselves from the scandal. Others simply disappeared, refusing to answer calls or respond to messages. Even his own family seemed wary of being associated with him. His wife stopped attending public events and his children avoided talking about the situation altogether. Alone in his mansion, surrounded by luxury but devoid of support, the billionaire felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He tried to fight back, of course. He hired crisis managers, PR firms, and even a team of hackers to dig up dirt on anyone connected to the leaks. But nothing worked. Every attempt to shift blame or discredit the accusations only made things worse. The more he pushed, the deeper the hole became. It was like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. Reporters grew bolder, investigators dug harder, and the public turned against him completely. Once admired for his wealth and success, he was now vilified as a symbol of greed and corruption. As the days dragged on, the billionaire found himself questioning everything. How had it come to this? When did things go so wrong? He replayed memories, in his mind, searching for answers. Was it the first time he signed off on a shady deal? The moment he chose profit over ethics? Or was it earlier than that, back when he started believing his own hype, thinking he was untouchable? But the truth was simple. None of it mattered anymore. The past couldn't be changed, and the present offered no escape. All he could do was brace himself for what came next. Meanwhile, the general watched quietly from the sidelines. He didn't need to intervene directly. The dominoes were falling exactly as planned. Each scandal, each resignation, each financial loss brought the billionaire closer to ruin. What had started as a personal affront at the airport had evolved into something much bigger, a reckoning for years of unchecked power and privilege. The general wasn't naive enough to think this would fix everything. It wouldn't, but it was a start. A reminder that accountability wasn't optional, no matter how high you stood or how deep your pockets ran. Still, the general knew better than to celebrate too soon. Bringing down one man wasn't enough, not when the system that enabled him remained intact. If anything, this operation was a test, a proof of concept. Could someone with access to classified resources and global networks hold the powerful accountable without stepping into the spotlight? So far, the answer seemed to be yes. But the real challenge lay ahead, ensuring that lessons were learned and changes implemented. To that end, the general began working on the final phase of his plan. He reached out to trusted allies within government agencies and international organizations, sharing evidence collected during the investigation. This wasn't just about punishing the billionaire. It was about exposing the larger network of corruption he represented. Shell companies, offshore accounts, illegal arms deals. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much bigger problem, one that spanned industries and crossed borders. By shining a light on these practices, the general hoped to spark reforms that would prevent similar abuses in the future. At the same time, he took steps to protect those who might face retaliation. Whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators involved in uncovering the truth needed safeguards to ensure their safety. The general used his connections to arrange anonymous protection programs, secure communications channels, and legal defenses. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. After all, justice couldn't exist without courage, and courage often required shielding. Back at the billionaire's mansion, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Law enforcement officials arrived unannounced one morning, armed with warrants and subpoenas. They searched the property thoroughly, seizing documents, computers, and phones. The billionaire cooperated silently, knowing resistance was futile. As they led him away in handcuffs later that day, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, unable or unwilling to say a word. News of his arrest spread quickly, dominating headlines around the globe. Commentators debated whether this marked the beginning of a broader crackdown on corporate corruption. Activists praised the move as a victory for transparency and accountability. Critics argued it was too little, too late. Regardless of opinions, one thing was clear. The billionaire's fall from grace served as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition. For the general, watching the news coverage was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that justice had been served. On the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. There were others out there, people who thought they were untouchable, who believed their wealth and influence granted them immunity, and as long as they operated unchecked, the cycle of exploitation and abuse would continue. That night, sitting alone in his office, the general reflected on everything that had happened. The insults at the airport, the painstaking investigation, the strategic dismantling of an empire, it had all been worth it. Not because it proved a point or settled a score, but because it sent a message, a reminder that no one was above the law, no matter how powerful they seemed. But the work wasn't over. In fact, it might never be. Power had a way of finding new hosts, corrupting whoever wielded it if left unchecked. The general understood this better than most. That's why he vowed to keep fighting, not for recognition or glory, but because it was the right thing to do. Someone had to stand up for those without a voice to hold the powerful accountable when they crossed the line. As he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, the general stepped out into the cool night air. The city buzzed with life around him, oblivious to the battles fought in its shadows. Somewhere another story was unfolding, another injustice waiting to be exposed, another corrupt figure believing they were untouchable. And when the time came, the general would be ready. The billionaire's arrest dominated the news for weeks, but the story didn't end there. It was only the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that rippled across industries, governments, and communities worldwide. People who had once looked up to him as a symbol of success now saw him as a cautionary tale. His downfall became a topic of debate in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms. Some argued it was karma, others called it justice. But everyone agreed on one thing: no one was untouchable. For the general, the aftermath of the operation brought both relief and reflection. He had achieved what he set out to do, exposing corruption, dismantling an empire built on greed, and holding someone accountable for their actions. But instead of feeling triumphant, he felt a quiet sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the system that allowed such abuses to happen in the first place. The billionaire might have been punished, but the structures enabling his behavior still existed. And unless they were addressed, history would repeat itself. In the days following the arrest, the general worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the investigation didn't stop at one individual. Using the evidence he had gathered, he collaborated with international agencies to trace the web of connections linking the billionaire to other powerful figures. What emerged was a sprawling network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and illegal deals spanning multiple countries. The scale of it was staggering, revealing how deeply entrenched corruption had become in global systems. The general knew that taking down this entire network wouldn't be easy or quick. It required patience, persistence, and cooperation from governments around the world. Some nations were eager to help, seeing an opportunity to clean up their own backyards. Others resisted, fearing exposure of their own complicity. But the general wasn't deterred. Every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. If enough people joined the fight, change was possible. At the same time, he turned his attention to safeguarding those who had risked everything to make the operation a success. Journalists who had published explosive stories, whistleblowers who had come forward with critical information, and investigators who had pieced together the puzzle. All of them faced potential retaliation. The general used his resources to provide them with protection, setting up anonymous safe houses and encrypted communication channels. He also lobbied for stronger laws to shield whistleblowers, knowing their courage was essential for accountability. But perhaps the most important part of his work was raising awareness. The billionaire's fall had captured public attention, but without sustained focus, the momentum could fade. To keep the conversation alive, the general reached out to advocacy groups, activists, and educators. Together, they launched campaigns to educate people about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of transparency. Documentaries, podcasts, and social media movements spread the message far and wide, inspiring countless individuals to demand better from their leaders. Back in his own life, the general returned to his routine, blending back into the background, where he preferred to stay. There were no parades or medals waiting for him, just the satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. He continued serving his country, leading missions, and mentoring younger officers. But the lessons of this operation stayed with him, shaping how he approached every challenge moving forward. He had learned that true strength wasn't about wielding power, it was about using it wisely, standing up for what was right even when it was hard. As months passed, the billionaire's name faded from headlines, replaced by new scandals and controversies. But the impact of his downfall lingered. Companies began reevaluating their practices, tightening regulations, and implementing stricter oversight. Governments passed laws targeting tax evasion and money laundering. Citizens grew more vigilant, demanding answers when something seemed off. Slowly but surely, the tide began to shift. One evening, sitting alone in his modest home, the general flipped through a stack of letters he had received since the operation ended. Some were from grateful whistleblowers thanking him for protecting them. Others came from ordinary citizens inspired by the story, sharing how it motivated them to speak out against injustice in their own lives. Each letter reminded him why he did what he did, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. He thought back to that day at the private airport when laughter and mockery echoed around him. At the time, it had stung, not because it hurt his pride, but because it highlighted a deeper divide between those who served and those who profited. Now, looking back, he realized it had been a turning point, a moment that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths and take action. Without it, none of this would have happened. The general smiled faintly, folding the letters and placing them back in a drawer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. Corruption wouldn't disappear overnight, and neither would the arrogance of those who believed themselves above the law. But progress had been made, and that gave him hope. As long as there were people willing to stand up and say enough, change was possible. Outside, the city lights twinkled in the distance, casting a warm glow over the horizon. Somewhere out there, another story was unfolding. Another injustice waiting to be exposed. Another corrupt figure thinking they were untouchable. And when the time came, the general would be ready. Until then, he would continue doing what he always did, staying in the shadows, working quietly, and fighting for a better future. Because that's what heroes do. Not for glory or fame, but because it's the right thing to do.